I really got a terrible daughter-in-law, didn't I? That girl is useless, so there's no hope. When I left work early and entered the house, I could hear my mother-in-law's voice from the living room. I instinctively lowered my breath and listened carefully. I'm getting a huge inheritance, you know. Since I'm receiving it, there's no need to be stingy, right? After all, I'm doing most of the housework, you know. I even ironed that girl's shirts for her. Well, I have to admit, I'm doing it to spend her inheritance. But still, I'm doing it. It seems like she's talking about me. My mother-in-law is talking about me. But I'm taken aback by her tone. My usual mother-in-law is very kind and considerate, even taking the initiative with household chores. I've never heard her speak like this before. Calling me a bad daughter-in-law or useless? Was my mother-in-law always like this? And talking about an inheritance? Could she be referring to that thing I inherited from my aunt? I quietly approached the living room, concealing my footsteps and presence. If she didn't have an inheritance, that girl, I wouldn't have accepted her as a daughter-in-law. She's plain and uninteresting. She's the kind of daughter-in-law you can't brag about to the neighbors. It's all for the sake of money, isn't it? Endurance, it's all about endurance. During all this time, my mother-in-law had been constantly making derogatory comments about me. I wonder who she's talking to. I discreetly peeked inside and saw the person she was talking to. I gasped in surprise, and my mother-in-law, with a smirk on her face, said, "That's right," and clapped her hands. She passed away, leaving an inheritance for that girl. She was her niece, you see. But the truth is... I felt like screaming as my mother-in-law spoke, but I quickly covered my mouth. No way. Can that really be? My name is Arya. I'm a 28-year-old housewife. I met my husband Luke through a coworker's invitation to a group date. We got to know each other at the mixer, and we hit it off, starting a relationship. I lost my parents in an accident when I was young, and my father's sister, Caroline, raised me. Even though Aunt Caroline had gone through a divorce when she was young, she became a successful businesswoman and raised me with strict yet loving care. She put me through college, and when I received my first paycheck as a working adult, I treated her to a meal as a token of my gratitude. Around that time, Aunt Caroline was diagnosed with cancer. When we found out, it had already spread throughout her body, and there was nothing that could be done. She was given a short time to live. Aunt Caroline probably had a sense of what was coming. She entrusted her company to a trusted colleague, and there were no major disputes. Last year, Aunt Caroline passed away, and many people, including her employees and the company's legal counsel, attended her funeral.
Arya, are you okay? Take a break for a bit.
Luke, thank you. I had lost my only family member and was feeling worn out and down, but the one who encouraged me was my boyfriend at the time, who would later become my husband. He continued to support me, and he has been there for me ever since. Luke is truly kind. I want to spend the rest of my life with him. Afterward, he proposed to me, and I decided to get married. When we went to his house for the marriage proposal, my mother-in-law warmly welcomed me. If you, Arya, are willing to join our family, I would be very happy. She said it with joy and served tea. I had met my mother-in-law a few times before, and she had even visited our home when we were living together. However, I had never discussed my family before. So at this moment, I opened up and told her that both my parents had passed away, and my aunt, who had raised me, had also passed away last year. But my mother-in-law, without making a single unpleasant face, said, "It must have been tough," and she teared up as she comforted me. I felt relieved by her kindness. She was such a caring mother-in-law.
So, Arya, my mom has been divorced for a while now. Since I became a working adult, she's been living alone. But last month, she had a fall and injured her leg, and I started worrying about her age. Arya, if it's okay with you, would you be willing to live with my mom after we get married?
His proposal gave me a moment of hesitation. I had wanted to enjoy our newlywed life together, just the two of us. I wondered if I could manage living with my in-law. I'll take care of the household chores. Arya, it's okay for you to continue working, all right? I had wanted to keep working, so her offer was appreciated. Besides, my mother-in-law was a very kind and helpful person. I thought we might be able to make it work. With that in mind, I agreed to living together. And so the three of us started living together. Both my husband and I had busy jobs, but my mother-in-law graciously took care of the household tasks. She even prepared dinner for us before we got home, and I couldn't stop feeling grateful. We had been living like this for a while, but recently I started feeling that our place was too cramped. When we discussed our future, the idea of a slightly larger house came up. That's when we began considering moving to a new home. However, every time we discussed house options, my husband and mother-in-law started making demands for more upscale preferences. Thinking about having children in the future, it's better to have more rooms, right? And the living room should be spacious too.
In that case, considering Mom's future and to prevent further injuries, wouldn't it be better to have a barrier-free design? If we do that, the house should be reasonably spacious inside as well.
I'd also like to have a pantry, and maybe a kitchen with a counter. My mother-in-law and husband were enthusiastically making suggestions about the house. It seemed like the cost might be higher than I had initially thought. We do have some inheritance from my aunt, so we could cover it to some extent, but as I pondered this, my mother-in-law let out a somewhat troubled voice. Recently, there has been an increase in foreigners, and the security isn't great. Around here, the security is good and it's safe, isn't it? The location she pointed out on the map was a high-end residential area. I cautiously suggested that this might be a bit difficult, but my suggestion was met with a shake of the head. My mother-in-law expressed concern that if we had children and lived in an area with poor security, they wouldn't be able to play outside and it would be tough for them. She mentioned that I also had late work days, so it would be best to be in a safe place. She emphasized that she was thinking about my well-being, and my husband agreed with her.
I want to protect my family. Let's move to a place where we can feel even a little safer.
And so I was somewhat forcefully persuaded, and we ended up choosing a considerably expensive property. Then one day, I was feeling under the weather with a slight cold. Despite that, I had work that needed to be done, so I went to the office on a holiday. However, my fever started to rise around midday, and I began feeling dizzy, so I decided to leave work early. When I arrived home and opened the front door, I could hear my mother-in-law's voice coming from the living room. I really got a terrible daughter-in-law, didn't I? She's absolutely useless. I couldn't believe my ears at the words I was hearing. I instinctively held my breath at the entrance and strained to listen. I mean, she's inherited a huge inheritance, so couldn't she be a bit more generous with the new house? There's no need to be so stingy. I do most of the household chores, you know. I even iron that girl's shirts. But even though I say that, I'm enduring it, all for the sake of using that child's inheritance. That girl apparently means me. My mother-in-law was indeed talking about me, but her words left me in shock. My mother-in-law is usually very kind and considerate, and she would even take the lead in doing household chores. This was the first time I had heard her speak in such a tone. Calling me a terrible daughter-in-law or useless? Was this really the same person I knew as my mother-in-law? And the mention of inheritance, was she referring to the inheritance I received from my aunt? Carefully concealing my footsteps and presence, I quietly approached the living room. If she didn't have an inheritance, she wouldn't have become my daughter-in-law. She's plain, uninteresting, and not someone you can boast about in the neighborhood. But it's all for the sake of money, right? Endurance. It's all about endurance. During this time, my mother-in-law had been continuously making derogatory remarks about me. I wondered who she was talking to. I discreetly peeked inside and was taken aback when I saw who she was talking to. It was my husband.
Don't worry, Mom. Aria's aunt seemed to be quite wealthy, and it won't be long before we buy a house in an upscale neighborhood using the inheritance. Then after a while, we can just kick her out. My husband chuckled. It seemed like the two of them were plotting to manipulate me into using the inheritance. I never expected my husband to entertain such a cruel idea. Then my mother-in-law grinned,
and gave her approval with a triumphant gesture. She left an inheritance for that child. She was her aunt, but she went by the name Caroline. Actually, she was my classmate. Upon hearing this, I was so surprised that I almost screamed. I quickly covered my mouth with both hands. I couldn't believe that there was a connection between my mother-in-law and my aunt, so it was a shocking revelation. According to my mother-in-law, my aunt was a studious type, while my mother-in-law was considered a prima donna. But Caroline was the class representative and always nagging me. She used to say things like, "Throw your trash in the bin," and "Don't bully Claire," even though she was a plain studious type. She was so cheeky I really disliked her. But I was popular, and I thought Caroline would live a plain life in the shadows forever. And yet, my mother-in-law bit her lip with a look of frustration. 20 years ago, she had met my aunt at a class reunion. Back then, my aunt was a quiet, studious person, but she had transformed into a successful businesswoman. Seeing how everyone praised and admired her, my mother-in-law couldn't help but feel envious. Despite both of them being divorced, she couldn't help but feel so frustrated by the stark contrast, and was overwhelmed with embarrassment and regret. She had been harboring jealousy towards my aunt for a long time. It was during this period that my husband brought me to meet her. She thought I looked somewhat like my aunt since we had the same last name. She didn't think it was possible, so she probed her classmates. However, before they could meet in person, my aunt passed away. It seems my mother-in-law had concocted a scheme to exploit the inheritance, using the lie about her injury and my sympathy to gain an advantage.
I'm glad you noticed the inheritance, Mom. Without it, I might not have married Arya.
Right? When you two were living together, there was a time when I went to your room. I secretly checked Arya's bank statement. That's when I saw a substantial amount of inheritance had been deposited. As I watched the two of them laughing together, I was shocked. But gradually, a simmering anger welled up within me. So both of them were after my inheritance, huh? All the kindness, the marriage, and even taking care of the household chores. It was all just to use up my inheritance. I can't forgive them anymore. Just you wait. I'll pay you back double. No, I'll pay you back double. The next day, I said to them with a smile, I found the perfect place for both of you. I've already paid the down payment. When I conveyed this to my mother-in-law and husband, they were overjoyed, exclaiming, "It's a house in an upscale residential area." On moving day, I had to go to work in the morning due to job commitments, so I was out only in the morning. When I returned, all my belongings had been dumped in the trash area. Inside the house, the keys to the new home, the expensive furniture, my husband and mother-in-law's things, everything was gone. There was nothing left except a divorce certificate placed on the floor, as if to say, "You're no longer needed." I called my husband. "What is going on here?"
We have a new home now, so you're no longer needed.
When my husband answered the phone and heard my voice, he started laughing. Then he handed the phone to my mother-in-law. "I'm sorry, Arya. I originally hated you because you looked so much like Caroline. The house has already been sold, so if you don't want to get caught for trespassing, you'd better leave right now." But, shocked, I was about to say something, but my mother-in-law, looking satisfied, hung up the phone while laughing. "Well, I guess I should leave quickly," I muttered to myself and turned off my smartphone. The next day, when I turned my smartphone back on, I was surprised to see a huge number of missed calls. As soon as I powered it up, another call came in. It was from my husband.
Why aren't you at your parents' house?
Luke's voice sounded tired as he spoke. "You said you sold that house, didn't you? Have you already forgotten?"
I've been looking for you. What's up with that new place?
My husband was furious and yelling over the phone. In reality, our new home, while in an upscale neighborhood with a standalone house, was the cheapest option in the area. It was an old, run-down house hidden behind high-rise apartments. In the background, I could hear my mother-in-law yelling loudly alongside my husband. "Right? Isn't it the perfect place for you guys?" I couldn't hold back my laughter any longer. Yesterday I had pretended to be shocked, but after hanging up I had a good laugh because my plan had worked. I had actually moved to a luxury apartment that I had prepared in advance. What do you mean the perfect place? This is ridiculous. When I sneakily checked your bank statement, I saw that $300,000 had disappeared. I thought for sure you had used it for the new house. I overheard my mother-in-law accidentally revealing this behind my husband. Unfortunately, the money that had gone missing wasn't used to buy a house in the upscale neighborhood. It was used to purchase the luxury apartment where I live. So it was all a false alarm, in other words. Oh, by the way, technically that house is my property. The rent will be paid to me as the owner. Well, as long as it can be covered by Luke's monthly salary, though. When I said that, my mother-in-law questioned my husband on the phone about what I meant. In reality, my husband earns less than me monthly. Furthermore, upon further investigation, I found out that he had been receiving a generous amount of child support from his biological father out of goodwill. While the support has stopped after he became an adult, my husband had a habit of spending that money recklessly. It seems he couldn't shake off that habit as he had debts before we got married. He proudly boasted about snagging a high-income wife among his friends, but as my mother-in-law scolded him, I asked my mother-in-law, "Can you, Mom, really criticize others? Isn't the reason for your divorce because of your affair? Luke is not your biological child, right? And didn't your affair partner run away from you?" Upon hearing that, my husband was speechless. My mother-in-law, in a panicked tone, was trying to explain loudly. Over the phone, the two were shouting things like, "Come over here right now. I'll beat you to a pulp. I'll make you suffer." And they were yelling angrily. However, when I informed them through the lawyer that the divorce had been finalized, they went even more berserk, given their bizarre state. It seems that neighbors called the police. Just as I heard the sirens of a police car, I could hear over the phone that the two were being taken away by the police. In the end, the two were released the same day. However, given the income of my ex-husband, he couldn't afford to pay the rent and debts, resulting in them being kicked out of their home. It seems my ex-husband and ex-mother-in-law are now living in a small, cheap apartment. And by the way, when I sold the rundown house, I got a better price than I expected because they had turned it into a parking lot. Afterward, my ex-husband, who didn't know my current address, sent a letter to my company. The contents stated, "Since you were a married couple, if you divorce, you should split the assets in half. If it's a debt incurred during the marriage, Area also has an obligation to repay it," and so on. What is this person saying, I wonder? Well, never mind, let's leave it to the lawyer. I used to be the legal advisor for my aunt's company in this matter. I've decided to entrust it to Claire, the lawyer. According to the lawyer who went to meet with both of them, during the discussion my ex-mother-in-law apparently turned pale upon seeing the lawyer. It turns out the lawyer was once a classmate of my ex-mother-in-law who used to harass her. At that time, she weighed 80 kilograms, but now she has slimmed down considerably. Even if she might be unrecognizable as a different person, traces of her former self remained. She used to be a great partner for my aunt as her legal advisor, but it seems my ex-mother-in-law wasn't aware of that. "If you continue to hound Area any further, I will completely crush all of you." The lawyer, while laughing at my ex-mother-in-law and the others, it seems they exerted pressure in a low voice. Premarital debts are not the responsibility of the wife to repay. Furthermore, since the inheritance was acquired before marriage, Luke does not have any rights to it. She firmly asserted this to my ex-husband once again. Furthermore, with regards to my ex-mother-in-law, "Caroline is different from you. She built her wealth through her own efforts, unlike you who deceived her husband and cheated. I'd rather not be associated with you," she said. And my ex-mother-in-law, unable to say anything in response, just hung her head, her face pale. Afterward, my ex-husband found himself drowning in debt and tried desperately to find ways to gather money. It seems he was abandoned even by his friends. He tried to cling to my ex-father-in-law, who had been providing child support, but he coldly pushed him away. It seems he eventually called the police after his persistent attempts. In the end, when he tried to borrow money from a colleague at work, they reported it to the appropriate department, stating that he had been stalking them. Consequently, he ended up resigning voluntarily. It seems he's now living a modest life with his mother, but they apparently argue every day, sometimes prompting neighbors to call the police. Still, due to a lack of money, living together is the only option. Even after selling the things he had indulged in buying all this time, it seems the debt didn't decrease. The two, who couldn't fully let go of the inheritance, came barging into my company, but of course, they were escorted away by the police. Afterwards, it was a relief that a lawyer worked to obtain a restraining order against them approaching me. As for me, after selling the land, I became interested in increasing my wealth and actively studied for it. It seems I inherited a sense similar to my aunt's. After obtaining the financial planner qualifications, I also learned a bit about investments. Since transitioning to a job as an FP, work has been enjoyable. I think it might be okay not to get married for a while.
You look just like Caroline when you're working happily.
Really? That makes me very happy if it's true.
I've never had much self-confidence, but thanks to Caroline's encouragement, I was able to change. I've always been grateful for that.
Claire's face as she spoke showed full confidence. She had worked hard to pave her own way, and in turn, become someone who could inspire confidence in others. I aspire to become someone like my aunt someday.